This ebook is brought to you by Egenvard 1998. Provinces of the Mind. For nearly 2 decades, Freud's only model of the mind was the topographic one we have just outlined, and his only portrayal of psychic strife was the conflict between conscious and unconscious forces. Then, during the 1920s, Freud introduced a 3-part structural model. This division of the mind into 3 provinces did not supplant the topographic model, but it helped Freud explain mental images according to their functions or purposes. To Freud, the most primitive part of the mind was das Es, or the id, which is almost always translated into English as ID. A second division was das Ich, or the I, translated as ego, and a final province was das Über-Ich, or the over-I, which is rendered into English as superego. These provinces or regions have no territorial existence, of course, but are merely hypothetical constructs. They interact with the 3 levels of mental life so that the ego cuts across the various topographic levels and has conscious, preconscious, and unconscious components. Whereas the superego is both preconscious and unconscious and the ID is completely unconscious. The ID. The ID at the core of personality and completely unconscious is the psychical region called the ID, a term derived from the impersonal pronoun meaning the id, or the not yet owned component of personality. The ID has no contact with reality, yet it strives constantly to reduce tension by satisfying basic desires. Because its sole function is to seek pleasure, we say that the ID serves the pleasure principle. A newborn infant is the personification of an ID unencumbered by restrictions of ego and superego. The infant seeks gratification of needs without regard for what is possible, that is, demands of the ego, or what is proper, that is, restraints of the superego. Instead, it sucks when the nipple is either present or absent and gains pleasure in either situation. Although the infant receives life-sustaining food only by sucking a nurturing nipple, it continues to suck because its ID is not in contact with reality. The infant fails to realize that thumb-sucking behavior cannot sustain life. Because the ID has no direct contact with reality, it is not altered by the passage of time or by the experiences of the person. Childhood wish impulses remain unchanged in the ID for decades. Besides being unrealistic and pleasure-seeking, the ID is illogical and can simultaneously entertain incompatible ideas. For example, a woman may show conscious love for her mother while unconsciously wishing to destroy her. These opposing desires are possible because the ID has no morality, that is, it cannot make value judgments or distinguish between good and evil. However, the ID is not immoral, merely amoral. All of the ID's energy is spent for one purpose: to seek pleasure without regard for what is proper or just. In review, the ID is primitive, chaotic, inaccessible to consciousness, unchangeable, amoral, illogical, unorganized, and filled with energy received from basic needs and discharged for the satisfaction of the pleasure principle. As the region that houses basic drives, primary motivates, the ID operates through the primary process. Because it blindly seeks to satisfy the pleasure principle, its survival is dependent on the development of a secondary process to bring it into contact with the external world. This secondary process functions through the ego. The ego, or I, is the only region of the mind in contact with reality. It grows out of the ID during infancy and becomes a person's sole source of communication with the external world. It is governed by the reality principle, which it tries to substitute for the pleasure principle of the ID. As the sole region of the mind in contact with the external world, the ego becomes the decision-making or executive branch of personality. However, because it is partly conscious, partly preconscious, and partly unconscious, the ego can make decisions on each of these 3 levels. For instance, a woman's ego may consciously motivate her to choose excessively neat, well-tailored clothes because she feels comfortable when well dressed. At the same time, she may be only dimly, i.e., preconsciously, aware of previous experiences of being rewarded for choosing nice clothes. In addition, she may be unconsciously motivated to be excessively neat and orderly due to early childhood experiences of toilet training. Thus, her decision to wear neat clothes can take place in all three levels of mental life. When performing its cognitive and intellectual fictions, the ego must take into consideration the incompatible but equally unrealistic demands of the ID and the superego. In addition to these two tyrants, the ego must serve a third master, the external world. Thus, the ego constantly tries to reconcile the blind, irrational claims of the ID and the superego with the realistic demands of the external world. Finding itself surrounded on three sides by divergent and hostile forces, the ego reacts in a predictable manner. It becomes anxious. It then uses repression and other defense mechanisms to defend itself against this anxiety. According to Freud, the ego becomes differentiated from the ID when infants learn to distinguish themselves from the outer world. While the ID remains unchanged, the ego continues to develop strategies for handling the ID's unrealistic and unrelenting demands for pleasure. At times the ego can control the powerful, pleasure-seeking ID, but at other times it loses control. In comparing the ego to the ID, Freud used the analogy of a person on horseback. The rider checks and inhibits the greater strength of the horse but is ultimately at the mercy of the animal. Similarly, the ego must check and inhibit ID impulses, but it is more or less constantly at the mercy of the stronger but more poorly organized ID. The ego has no strength of its own but borrows energy from the ID. In spite of this dependence on the ID, the ego sometimes comes close to gaining complete control, for instance, during the prime of life of a psychologically mature person. As children begin to experience parental rewards and punishments, they learn what to do in order to gain pleasure and avoid pain. At this young age, pleasure and pain are ego functions because children have not yet developed a conscience and ego ideal, that is, a superego. As children reach the age of 5 or 6 years, they identify with their parents and begin to learn what they should and should not do. This is the origin of the superego. The superego. In Freudian psychology, the superego, or above I, represents the moral and ideal aspects of personality and is guided by the moralistic and idealistic principles as opposed to the pleasure principle of the ID and the realistic principle of the ego. The superego grows out of the ego, and like the ego, it has no energy of its own. However, the superego differs from the ego in one important respect: it has no contact with the outside world and therefore is unrealistic in its demands for perfection. The superego has two subsystems, the conscience and the ego ideal. Freud did not clearly distinguish between these two functions, but, in general, the conscience results from experiences with punishments for improper behavior and tells us what we should not do. Whereas the ego ideal develops from experiences with rewards for proper behavior and tells us what we should do. A primitive conscience comes into existence when a child conforms to parental standards out of fear of loss of love or approval. Later, during the Oedipal phase of development, these ideals are internalized through identification with the mother and father. A well-developed superego acts to control sexual and aggressive impulses through the process of repression. It cannot produce repressions by itself, but it can order the ego to do so. The superego watches closely over the ego, judging its actions and intentions. Guilt is the result when the ego acts or even intends to act contrary to the moral standards of the superego. Feelings of inferiority arise when the ego is unable to meet the superego's standards of perfection. Guilt, then, is a function of the conscience, whereas inferiority feelings stem from the ego ideal. The superego is not concerned with the happiness of the ego. It strives blindly and unrealistically toward perfection. It is unrealistic in the sense that it does not take into consideration the difficulties or impossibilities faced by the ego in carrying out its orders. Not all its demands, of course, are impossible to fulfill, just as not all demands of parents and other authority figures are impossible to fulfill. The superego, however, is like the ID in that it is completely ignorant of, and unconcerned with, the practicability of its requirements. Freud pointed out that the divisions among the different regions of the mind are not sharp and well defined. the development of the three divisions varies widely in different individuals. For some people, the superego does not grow after childhood. For others, the superego may dominate the personality at the cost of guilt and inferiority feelings. For yet others, the ego and superego may take turns controlling personality, which results in extreme fluctuations of mood and alternating cycles of self-confidence and self-deprecation. In the healthy individual, the ID and superego are integrated into a smooth functioning ego and operate in harmony and with a minimum of conflict.